Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. Please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
So, God audibly speaking to Dawkins wouldn't convince him. Jesus appearing at his second coming wouldn't convince him. God writing a message in the stars wouldn't convince him. What would convince him?
So that couldn't be enough. So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would.
Nothing would.
This is the center of the bullseye for David and other apologists. Here we have it, a plain as day admission of Dawkins' irrationality. He admits that nothing would change his mind. Therefore, and by definition, he's impervious to evidence. But is he though? Listen to what follows.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. Up for today is apologist David Wood and his attempted intellectual assassination of one Richard Dawkins, the famed Oxford professor and evolutionary biologist. David Wood has made a career out of attacking atheists and suggesting that we are impervious to evidence. The irony. David focuses the majority of his assault on what he calls atheist ringleaders. But David doesn't stop there. He goes so far as to suggest that atheists are members of a cult. Yes, you heard that right. So I didn't know that, folks. Perhaps you can fill me in. Apparently I'm in a cult now. Just didn't know that, didn't realize. So, when do I get my membership card? Do cults have membership cards? If so, I definitely want one.
I just want to punch a guy in the face.
In any case, David throws enough shade at Dawkins, atheists, and atheism more generally here that I think it's deserving of a response. So in this video, we're going to explore the epistemology of both David Wood and Richard Dawkins, in the hopes that we can settle this question about whether or not Dawkins is willing to change his mind. There will be many among you who'll undoubtedly say, who cares? Why does it matter, Magic Skeptic? Why are you spending time on this issue? Surely it doesn't matter if Dawkins is unwilling to change his mind. It's not like he's the Pope of atheism. Further still, such critics may say that even if it turns out that Dawkins is completely irrational, it doesn't change anything. It's not like atheism gets demoted if it turns out that Dawkins is impervious to evidence. These are very fair points, so before we proceed, I think a mission statement is in order. There is one primary reason why I want to explore this attempted intellectual assassination of Richard Dawkins by apologist David Wood. Allow me to explain. Whether you like it or not, Richard Dawkins is still a very influential atheist. His books sell millions of copies. His videos get hundreds of thousands of views, and his interview appearances often garner millions, etc. In short, Dawkins is a massively successful and highly visible atheist intellectual who, by extension, wields quite a bit of influence. Sure, said influence has its limits, but you're kidding me if you don't accept that Dawkins has influence amongst the general public. This level of visibility and influence has its pros and cons, and undoubtedly one of the primary cons is that Dawkins' reputation, rightly or wrongly, has a knock-on effect on atheism. In other words, if Dawkins says something stupid, at least as far as the general public is concerned, this makes atheism look stupid. If Dawkins says something irrational, atheism looks irrational, etc. And before anyone loses their mind in the comments, I agree with you that such thinking is ludicrous. But that doesn't change the fact that public perception is a real and extant phenomenon. By way of analogy, when a leading member of a political party is found to be guilty of a heinous crime, such a discovery shouldn't impact voting numbers because the crimes of the individual have nothing to do with party policies and the party's overall ability to govern effectively. Yet, time after time, when such things come to light, we do in fact observe a reduction in vote share for the party associated with the guilty individual. Clearly there exists exceptions to this pattern. Donald Trump. Sorry folks, I just got a bit of a cough there. I'm recovering from my winter flu.
It was all bullshit.
To repeat, clearly there exists exceptions, but generally speaking, and to put it plainly, guilt by association is a very real sociological phenomenon. So while Dawkins' intellectual integrity shouldn't, and indeed technically doesn't matter vis-a-vis the truth of atheism, the fact is, the public perception of Richard Dawkins does impact atheism. Some of you probably don't care about this at all, but I do, and here's why. For starters, I support church-state separation. I reject theocracy, and at a basic level, to quote Matt Dillahunty, I want people to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. If you share any of those goals, you should recognize that progress in those directions is hindered by a negative public perception of atheism. If atheism is viewed as irrational and unyielding, then people may reject it. If atheists are viewed as dogmatic, then any campaign for church-state separation may be viewed as extreme. If atheism is viewed as evangelical, then any talk of the dangers of theocracy may be ignored. Suffice to say, the public perception of atheism matters if you care about avoiding a future where religious dictates become law. And this is where the apologetics community has got a leg up on the atheist community. I must credit apologists like David Wood. People like him recognize this simple fact, that is, that public perception matters. My fellow atheists don't appear to recognize this truth. Even in my previous video about Dawkins and Wood, numerous commenters relayed their apathy regarding any and all discussion about Dawkins. Who cares what he thinks, they said. He's not the Pope of atheism, they exclaimed, etc. Again, I understand the sentiment here, but Wood has recognized a deeper, call it a tactical truth, which is tearing down Dawkins and other influential atheist intellectuals furthers the Christian agenda. Meanwhile, my atheist brothers and sisters insist that such attacks are irrelevant to the truth of atheism. And of course, they're right, but tactically speaking, they couldn't be more wrong. So to summarize, I believe that it's tactically wise to examine this attempted intellectual assassination of Richard Dawkins. For if Wood is mistaken, pointing out Wood's mistake helps to maintain a positive public perception of atheism. And at a more basic level, isn't it only fair and right to correct the record if indeed Wood is misrepresenting Dawkins as deeply unreasonable? After all, if my name was being unfairly sullied, I would hope that someone would correct the record. To be clear, my goal with this video is not to defend anything and everything that Richard Dawkins has ever said. Dawkins and I presumably disagree on a whole host of issues, be they moral, political, social, etc. But those domains are beyond the scope of this video. Dawkins' opinions in any or all of those areas may very well be irrational. But even if that were the case, it's irrelevant to the question that I'm exploring in this video. Namely, whether or not Dawkins' comments on God are irrational. So jumping into the comments below and waxing lyrical about Dawkins' irrationality in other domains is beside the point. The question is David Wood correct when he alleges that Richard Dawkins and other atheists are irrational and impervious to evidence? So to that end, let's dive into Dawkins' comments, the very words which reveal his irrationality, according to apologist David Wood.
Remember when Richard Dawkins gave powerful arguments against the existence of God? Neither do I. Dawkins is one of the pioneering ringleaders of that circus we call the New Atheism. If you're not familiar with the group, the New Atheism is like the Old Atheism if the Old Atheism got rabies.
No, David. In actuality, New Atheism isn't that different from Old Atheism. It's just that the atheists of today no longer have to remain silent on pain of death, where I live at least. And that's a crucial point, by the way. There are still parts of the world where one risks their life should they admit their doubts. But leave it to an apologist to view open discourse, unimpeded by death threats, as inappropriate. The only thing that has rabies, good sir, is that dormant and decaying organ you call your brain.
Back in the 1980s and 1990s, atheists generally didn't care what other people believed. They were like, oh, if you think your God and your book help you, that's fine for you, but I don't need that. Then Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens came along and turned that cute little atheist puppy into Cujo. How did they do it?
David is making a lot of claims here, and unsurprisingly, he's not providing any receipts. Asserting that atheists in the 80s and 90s didn't care what people believed is just that, an assertion. David may be correct, but without statistical data to back it up, he's just preaching. Whatever the case may be, David evidently prefers when atheists keep their mouths shut. Well, I'm sorry, David, buddy, but that ain't happening anymore. Not while I've got a mouth this size.
How did atheism go from Winnie the Pooh to Cocaine Bear almost overnight? Well, Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens were the first people to successfully use cult tactics on a large scale with atheists. Turns out, if you want to mobilize and weaponize your listeners, arguments and evidence just aren't the way to go in the 21st century. Manipulating people into joining and expanding your group is massively more efficient and effective. Keep in mind, I'm not advocating manipulation and cult tactics. I'm simply describing the world we now live in.
The projection that's on offer here is stupefying. Atheist cult tactics? Are you kidding me? You mean cult tactics like baptizing babies and indoctrinating children? A widely but not universally practiced phenomenon in Christianity. You mean cult tactics like the doctrine of eternal punishment, which scares people into doing what they're told lest they burn forever. A widely but not universally accepted tenet of Christianity. You mean cult tactics like disfellowshipping and ostracization for the crime of questioning or not living according to certain doctrines and practices. An admittedly less common but still very real problem in pockets of Christianity. It would seem, dear listener, that every accusation is itself a confession. Have some self-awareness, David, for Christ's sake.
If you want a group that's going to march out into the world and mindlessly carry out your commands like drones, you need cult tactics. You instill in your followers an us versus everyone else mentality. It's us against the world. You give them an unmerited self-esteem boost just for being in your group. In this case, it's, oh, if you're part of our group, you're smart. If you're not part of our group, you're dumb. You stir up their emotions and give them a sense of urgency. Oh man, Christians are on the verge of forming a theocracy. If we don't stop this religion thing right now, we're all doomed.
While I'm not aware of anybody claiming that we're all doomed, it is rather concerning how David manages to shrug off the threat of theocracy. I'm not sure if David sincerely believes that theocracy isn't a threat, or whether he's attempting to pull the wool over our eyes, but make no mistake, theocratic encroachment is definitely a concern. I'm not politically savvy, but from the outside looking in, separation of church and state is a problem in the US. During his first term, Trump appointed 3 Republican and, more importantly, Christian justices to the Supreme Court. And unsurprisingly, Roe v. Wade was overturned soon after. And how did all 3 Trump-appointed justices vote on this matter? I won't insult your intelligence by answering that question. Now, some will undoubtedly allege that the overturning of Roe v. Wade had nothing to do with theocracy or separation of church and state. But we all know it's not a coincidence that these justices voted as they did. It's clear to me, at least, that these justices have begun to infuse the Constitution with Christian tenets, and it's entirely reasonable to be concerned about the possibility that they are not done. So what's going to be on the ballot next, eh? The abolition of gay marriage? The banning of contraception? The outlawing of so-called blasphemy? No reasonable person could possibly suggest that such concerns are unwarranted, especially now that Trump is president again. So David's cavalier dismissal of concerns about theocracy is either ill-informed or deceptive. Either way, nobody should take it seriously.
The vast majority of the new atheists that you'll encounter have never actually studied any of the arguments for theism. Instead, they have extremely devout, dare I say it, faith that their leaders have carefully thought through these issues for them. There's just one problem. The leaders of the new atheism haven't carefully considered the evidence and concluded that there's no evidence for the existence of God. They've done something far simpler and far more cult-like. They've constructed a methodology that is absolutely impervious to evidence.
Now we're getting to the meat. And need I mention it? The projection is once again off the bloody charts. We'll get to whether or not atheists have created a worldview that's impervious in a moment. But we know for sure that many theists have done just this. The entire history of apologetics could be summarized as the attempt to massage and mold the God hypothesis such that falsification can be prevented. Every time the prospect of falsifying God is even hinted at, theists are quick to redefine God in order to prevent falsification. This has resulted in a God that's so amorphous and ambiguous in its description that I'm honestly unsure about what God is. Nouns have a referent. For example, the word dog refers to those joyous and wonderful four-legged canines, but I couldn't possibly tell you what God refers to. An allegedly spaceless, timeless, and immaterial entity. That sounds incomprehensible to me.
Mr. Krabs, I am so confused.
How can something exist if not in a given place at a given time? To be clear, I'm not suggesting that my inability to conceptualize God disproves the hypothesis. All I'm drawing attention to here is the esoteric and rather tortured definition that's come about. And given that this is how Christians often define God, it's unbelievably hypocritical to complain about the alleged imperviousness of atheism to evidence. After all, no state of affairs appears to be sufficient to debunk God. For example, if I as a skeptic point out that I've never seen God, theists are quick to raise objections, pointing out that God wants to remain hidden, because if he revealed himself, he would rob us of our ability to freely come to believe in him. But how did you arrive at that conclusion? How can you infer what God's reasons are? If God is truly inaccessible as you claim, then presumably his mindset is inaccessible. Yet, none of this stops theists from dreaming up ad hoc justifications which explain God's seeming absence. Not to mention the fact that the Bible tells of numerous instances where God does reveal his existence unambiguously. So what am I to take from this? Does God play favourites? Am I not good enough for a road to Damascus experience? But I digress. The problem of evil is another area where the unfalsifiability of God becomes clear. Think about it. Christians believe that God is all-loving and all-powerful. And no matter how much suffering happens, they create just so stories to make the data reconcilable with their theology. Not even something as brutal as the Holocaust undermines their theology. They allege that God gave us free will and the price of such freedom is moral evil. We'll just conveniently forget that people in heaven have free will, yet there's no evil there, thereby demonstrating that moral evil is not a necessary accompaniment of free will. We'll also forget that God has free will, yet he's incapable of evil. Yet another example which demonstrates that having free will doesn't require the ability to commit moral evil. The point I'm making is simple. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and boy is Christianity a glass house. Don't you dare sit there and wag your finger at atheists, alleging that atheism is impervious to evidence, while simultaneously believing in a theology that is principally unfalsifiable because of the attempts of apologists just like you, David. You guys have dedicated your careers to rendering God unfalsifiable. In other words, you guys have produced a theology that is actually impervious to evidence. Yet you sit there on your high horse, alleging that atheists are the irrational ones? Christians wrote the bloody book on how to render a worldview unfalsifiable, and don't let's forget that.
If God exists, how could he convince Richard Dawkins that he exists?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus or a great big, deep, booming bass Paul Robeson voice saying, I am God and I created.
So he used to say that the second coming of Jesus or an audible voice from God would convince him. But then he realized that these things wouldn't convince him at all.
I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, richarddawkins.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something.
Notice, if God did speak, and if Jesus did return, coming on the clouds of heaven with legions of angels, Dawkins still wouldn't believe in God, because a more probable explanation to him would be that it's all a hallucination or a magic trick.
David appears to imply here that it would be deeply unreasonable to doubt the existence of God after hearing a voice or witnessing the second coming of Jesus. But the reality is, Dawkins is spot on here. Hallucination is a likelier explanation. Why? Because we have actual evidence for the psychological phenomenon of hallucination. For example, certain drugs reliably produce hallucinatory experience. So too does elemental fear and various psychological and physiological conditions. God, on the other hand, is nowhere to be seen. Show me a God, David. Show me some trace evidence at least. Scriptures won't cut it, no more than David would accept the Quran, the Mahabharata, or the Guru Granth Sahib. In short, David's insinuation that religious experience is case-closed evidence for God is utter nonsense. And as I've pointed out before, David doesn't even believe this talking point, for when he encounters the religious experience claims of other faiths, he's just as quick to table alternative hypotheses. Consider the following example where David discusses the alleged appearance of the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, and listen to how quickly David reinterprets the data in order to debunk Islam.
Muslims think of this, as a wonderful night when Muhammad starts receiving revelations. Whatever he encountered, he's the only one there, whatever he encountered in that cave, he was convinced that it was demonic and squishing him, and he ran out of there depressed and suicidal and tried to kill himself as a result of it, concluding that he was demon-possessed. And I would just have to say, sometimes your first impression is the correct one.
Funny, isn't it? According to David, doubting the religious experiences of his faith renders one impervious to evidence. It renders one a deeply irrational human being. But doubting the religious experiences of other faiths, that's fair game. This is called having it all your own way, folks. Now, some of you may be tempted to protest and point out that David isn't doubting that Muhammad had a religious experience. Rather, he's interpreting that religious experience as involving a demon as opposed to the angel Gabriel. But such a protest is pedantic in the extreme. Clearly, such an interpretation of a pivotal Islamic doctrine serves as a defeater for the faith. Ergo, David's thesis calls into question the legitimacy of Islam. Please notice that if David were a Muslim, he'd be saying the same things he's saying about the second coming of Jesus, but about the angel Gabriel instead. He'd be reminding us that Muhammad's religious experience is compelling evidence for Allah, and that any atheist who witnessed the same thing and doubted the existence of Allah would be completely impervious to evidence. But no, because David is a Christian, when it comes to the religious experience of the Prophet Muhammad, it must have been demons. The lack of self-awareness is staggering. And again, Dawkins is correct. Probability dictates that hallucination is a likelier explanation than God, because we have countless confirmed examples of hallucination and zero confirmed examples of gods. So this back and forth doesn't demonstrate Dawkins' imperviousness to evidence. All it demonstrates in actuality is David's inability to understand probability.
But they're not finished.
So if you walked out and there were these globes that were spinning around that said, I am God, believe in me, or the famous Krauss thing, you walk out into the sky and it spells out in the stars in different languages, I am God, believe in me.
So now we walk outside and we see a message written in the stars. The stars have been rearranged so that they spell out, I am God, believe in me, in multiple languages. Surely that would convince these guys who always go where the evidence points, right?
Well, again, the problem is it could be a delusion, but the other problem is you'd have to rule out alternative explanations.
So there could be other explanations for why a message about God was written in the stars.
Yes, David, there could be alternative explanations for an allegedly religious message appearing in the stars. Just like there could be alternative explanations for the Prophet Muhammad being visited by the angel Gabriel. Remember that, David? Remember how you were so quick to table an alternative explanation when it comes to the religious experiences of another faith? Well, yeah, that exact same reasoning applies to your faith as well, David. To suggest otherwise is special pleading in its most obvious form. But it's just typical, isn't it? The apologist whose criticisms of other faiths are perceptive and cutting, but whose criticisms of their own faith are non-existent. This is called having it all your own way, folks. So again, yes, and despite David's incredulity, there are other potential explanations for witnessing an allegedly divine message written in the stars. Consider the following example.
You'd have to rule out alternative explanations, like the aliens. I mean, you'd have to... How could you rule out... Well, I mean, there could be an alien trickster culture or something. We're going to get those little humans.
Maybe powerful alien tricksters wrote the message in the stars as part of a cosmic prank.
David's tone here implies that the alien hypothesis is a silly explanation. But consider the fact that aliens are merely life forms that evolved elsewhere in the universe. Such beings are orders of magnitude more likely than a spaceless, timeless, and immaterial mind. Why? Because we know that life forms exist. We also know that life can evolve in the harshest of environments, as extremophiles demonstrate. Add to this the sheer size of the universe, and it seems not only possible, but probable that life has evolved elsewhere in the universe. Could they develop technology advanced enough to trick us? Would they even want to trick us? I grant you that these additional tenets would have to be built into the hypothesis in order to explain the messages in the hypothetical. But how is this any different from the tenets that get built into the God hypothesis? We're told not only that a God exists, in addition, we're told that God desired to create the universe and does. We're told that God wants to have a relationship with us, so much so that he sent his only begotten Son to die for us, etc. So you see, the aliens hypothesis does not have a monopoly on adding tenets in order to make the hypothesis explanatorily sufficient. David does this with his hypothesis as well. Sure, the aliens hypothesis requires the stipulation that these extraterrestrials want to deceive us into believing in a false God. But the God hypothesis requires the stipulation that the God in question wants to communicate with us. In other words, bare theism isn't enough for the God hypothesis to be explanatorily sufficient. One must pad the hypothesis with intention, namely, God's intention to communicate with us. Please notice that this is principally identical to the aliens hypothesis, where, once again, it's necessary to pad the hypothesis with intention, namely, the aliens' intention to deceive us. In short, both bare theism and bare aliens are not explanatorily sufficient hypotheses. In order to make them functional, both hypotheses require padding. Both require an intention to be stipulated. So David can get out of here with his incredulity.
Maybe powerful alien tricksters wrote the message in the stars as part of a cosmic prank.
He behaves as though the aliens hypothesis is absurd and strains credulity. Meanwhile, his hypothesis is just as padded, and worse still, his hypothesis appeals to incredibly unparsimonious phenomena such as unembodied minds and, dare I say, magic. Suffice to say, aliens are actually a likelier explanation, and no amount of sarcastic disbelief changes this.
Any aliens who could actually visit us would have to be so far beyond us in their technology that they probably could manipulate the stars to spell out words or geometric forms or something of that sort.
Aliens that are powerful enough to reach us could also be powerful enough to write out words in the stars. So, if we all walked outside one day and we read, "I am God, believe in me," written in the stars in multiple languages, we should definitely not believe in God, because that message could have been written by alien tricksters. So, God audibly speaking to Dawkins wouldn't convince him. Jesus appearing at his second coming Wouldn't convince him. God writing a message in the stars wouldn't convince him. What would convince him?
So that couldn't be enough. So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would.
Nothing would.
This is the center of the bullseye for David and other apologists. Here we have it, a plain as day admission of Dawkins' irrationality. He admits that nothing would change his mind. Therefore, and by definition, he's impervious to evidence. But is he though? Listen to what follows.
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would, which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming.
Did you catch that? Dawkins says that he's always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind in light of the evidence. He calls it lip service. Do you know what lip service means? It means you say one thing, but your actions show that you don't really believe what you're saying. So, for all his talk about going where the evidence points, he admits that when it comes to the existence of God, evidence is irrelevant.
Because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. The trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like.
And there you have it, Dawkins' view in its entirety. Theists will often seize upon the first part of what Dawkins says in this clip, when he points out that he's beginning to think that nothing would change his mind. But they rarely address the latter half, where he explains that this is because he finds it difficult to conceptualize what the evidence would look like.
The trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like.
Does this inability to conceptualize that which would change his mind serve as a demonstration of Dawkins' irrationality? Does this prove that Dawkins is impervious to evidence? David certainly thinks so, but Dawkins is in good company. It turns out that many leading atheists, just like Dawkins, struggle to articulate the kind of evidence that would change their mind. But don't take my word for it. Have a listen.
Do you feel like you could be persuaded by a really great argument, or would it take some kind of experience that just was somehow undeniable in your personal psychology or whatever to kind of shift you towards theism?
So this is a really difficult question, right? I mean, at this point, people often, think about Hume talking about in the dialogues about the voice in the sky. So people ask, what would it take? And the answer is, I have no idea, right? I mean, I don't see that something like that, a voice that speaks to everybody in their language, right? That's just not in the cards for, our world, right? Yeah. So, and even on most Christian stories, that's not on the cards, right? I'd say.
But when it comes to, I don't believe that a God exists, what would change my mind? That's a difficult question, because when you say evidence and argument, the natural follow-up question is, okay, you need to be more specific. What evidence would convince you? And the reason this is natural and intuitive is because this is the question we would ask for anything else. If I were to hold up this box of playing cards and say, do you believe that it has a complete deck of 52 cards in it? And in this case, you could say, well, we could open the box and count and make sure that there were in fact 52 cards in there, and that would confirm. Unfortunately, the God proposition and a number of other things that supposedly are part of a supernatural realm can't be addressed like this. And so a few years ago, after dealing with the problems of these answers, I came up with what I think is a better answer, what I think may be the best answer, not because I thought of it, but because I think it covers all the ground. And that is this. I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God. But if there is such a being as a God, then one would think that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened, which means that either this God does not exist, or this God doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, it's not my problem.
Some people might accuse you of being so committed to atheism that you'd never be willing to countenance any evidence that might lend support to a creator behind the universe. So I'm just interested, what sort of evidence could science or the physical universe present to you that would make you think, actually, that is evidence that there's a mind behind this?
I find that a very difficult question. If I were looking in the Bible for evidence, heaven forbid, I would expect to see maybe increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. And that is
if there was literally an equation in the Bible,
equation
like
in
that.
the Bible, rather than all this wishy-washy, elastic writing that it pervades.
All right. So if there was something like that they discovered in the Bible,
then I'd think it was probably a forgery. Anyway.
Well, exactly. The problem is, would it actually make you?
No.
I mean, is there anything from is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make? I mean, if the stars lined up to spell, Peter, please believe in me, it's about time.
I put it down to madness.
You put it down to
personal madness,
right?
Yeah.
It sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that will persuade you away from atheism.
Well, to be honest, I think that's probably the case.
In that sense, do you even have an evidence-based view if you're actually committed to atheism a priori?
Well, I'm predicting that there will be no such evidence. That's not quite the same thing as being committed to it a priori. I can't.
But you've said there's no evidence that would persuade you otherwise.
I think it's much more likely that I would have gone mad than such evidence would have been provided.
Right. So in principle, it's impossible to ever persuade you that God exists.
I didn't quite say that, but.
Well, what would persuade you?
I can't conceive of. I suppose, even if I died and was confronted with, St. Peter saying, "Welcome to heaven," I'd probably think I was dreaming.
No doubt, some of you will be quick to point out that this is a pretty wretched defense. After all, sharing with you the fact that many other leading atheists also struggle to articulate the kind of evidence that would change their mind hardly exonerates Dawkins. If anything, this renders more atheists guilty of the very thing David is accusing them of, namely, being impervious to evidence. But this couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is, there's a very good reason why atheists struggle to articulate the kind of evidence that would change their mind. The answer resides in the God hypothesis itself. The question, what would change your mind, is actually a surprisingly difficult one to answer vis-a-vis the God hypothesis. Why? This is due to the nature of the claim. We're talking about an entity which not only has never been demonstrated, but exists in a unique category of its own. God is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. How can one articulate that which would change their mind about the existence of something when they don't even know what that thing is and are incapable of conceptualizing it? Try it. Try conceptualizing something spaceless and timeless. After you fail, you may begin to realize why Dawkins and others struggle with this question. The truth is, the God claim is different. Were we discussing something trivial, like the temperature water boils at, and I was unconvinced that the answer is 100 degrees, it would be easy to conceptualize that which would change my mind. All I'd need is a functioning thermometer, some water, and a heat source. Please notice that hallucination is not a likelier explanation here because nothing fantastical, otherworldly, or outside the ordinary is involved. A simple measurement is taken, and said measurement falsifies my belief that water does not boil at 100 degrees. Even if material circumstances were such that I couldn't conduct the experiment, suppose I'm poor and unable to access a thermometer or water or what have you, I could still conceptualize that which would change my mind, namely the experiment I just described. Please notice that this isn't the same with God. I can't conceptualize an experiment to detect God. In fact, this may be principally impossible, for God is immaterial. How could something immaterial be detected? That sounds almost like a contradiction in terms. I could go on, but suffice to say, it's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to conceptualize God and/or the evidence that would confirm one. And atheists are not alone in this conclusion. Apophatic theology denies the possibility of describing God, claiming instead that the best one can do is say what God is not. God isn't physical, i.e., he's non-physical. God is not bound by time, i.e., God is eternal, etc. The apophatic tradition, in other words, acknowledges the problem that atheists face when asked, what would change your mind? Others have acknowledged the difficulty with describing God as well. Consider one of the most influential Christian thinkers of all time, Thomas Aquinas, who alleged that the best one can hope to do is speak of God analogically. At this point, it should be clear that conceptualizing God is not an atheist problem, it's a humanity problem. But David wants to make it an atheist problem so he can declare victory. Essentially, David wants atheists to solve an arguably intractable problem by inviting them to affirm and describe God and/or the trace evidence that such an entity would leave behind. All the while, the very description of this entity defies any expectation of discovering such evidence or even conceptualizing what this evidence would look like. Suffice to say, Dawkins' inability to articulate the kind of evidence that would change his mind on the God question does not serve as evidence for his stubbornness or irrationality. Rather, the atheist's struggle to answer the question, what would change your mind, serves only as evidence for how poorly and elusively David's God is defined. And here's the thing, it's trivially easy to create such a hypothesis, the kind of hypothesis which causes people to struggle and sweat when you ask them what kind of evidence would change their mind in relation to it. For example, presumably you agree with me that your memories are real. But what if I told you that humanity was created seconds ago with all of their memories intact? Furthermore, what if I told you that the being who created us was sure to structure the world such that it aligns with these false memories? Now ask yourself, how would you disprove this claim? Any appeal to your past experiences is rendered irrelevant by the hypothesis. So how could you demonstrate that humans weren't created seconds ago with all of our memories intact? If you reflect on this challenge, you'll realize that the hypothesis is constructed in such a manner as to render falsification impossible. Hence, your inability to falsify the hypothesis could hardly be marshalled as evidence of your irrationality. No, your inability to falsify the hypothesis has nothing to do with you and everything instead to do with the unfalsifiable nature of the hypothesis itself. And so too it is the case with the God hypothesis. No matter how elusive God is, theists will redefine him in order to escape falsification. Meanwhile, Dawkins honestly acknowledges his inability to articulate that which would change his mind, due in no small part to the elusive and ambiguous nature of the God hypothesis.
The trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like.
Yet David smugly assumes and downright asserts that atheists are merely stuck in their ways.
For all his talk about going where the evidence points, he admits that when it comes to the existence of God, evidence is irrelevant.
So in closing, it's clear to me that the reason Dawkins says that he's beginning to think that nothing would change his mind is because he's honestly unable to conceptualize the kind of evidence which would do so. But this, contrary to David's smears, does not serve as evidence for Dawkins' irrationality. The truth is, God is a mysterious concept, the referent of which is hitherto unobserved and may in fact be principally unobservable, especially given God's alleged immateriality. This entity exists, rather confusingly, in a state of timelessness and spacelessness, or did at one point at least. To call this confounding is an understatement. Even fellow theists have acknowledged these difficulties, as the apophatic tradition demonstrates. How can one articulate that which would change their mind when the subject in question is a mystery? Ask yourself, dear listener, what would change your mind about the existence of one Grabartha Schmoogle-Boogle? You mean you can't tell me? What if Grabartha Schmoogle-Boogle wrote their name in the stars above? Oh, you mean to tell me even then, even after such an awesome display of their power, you still wouldn't believe in the existence of Grabartha Schmoogle-Boogle? Well, in that case, you're clearly impervious to evidence. Bullshit! Clearly, because you don't know what Grabartha Schmoogle-Boogle is, you can't possibly comment on that which would change your mind. This is a no-brainer. Clearly, one's ignorance about what exactly Grabartha Schmoogle Boogle is renders one incapable of elucidating on that which would change their mind about Grabartha Schmoogle Boogle's existence. Not least because I just made up Grabartha Schmoogle Boogle, but this serves to make a point. The utterly incomprehensible nature of God, as acknowledged by some leading theists themselves, makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to answer the question, what would change your mind? But David pretends that this is an epistemological failing of Dawkins and atheists more generally, when in reality, Dawkins is more than capable of articulating that which would falsify his beliefs in other areas. Consider the following clip where Dawkins articulates that which would falsify his belief in evolutionary theory, his life's work, I might add.
What would be evidence against evolution, and very strong evidence at that, would be the discovery of even a single fossil in the wrong geological stratum. J.B.S. Haldane famously retorted when asked to name an observation that would disprove the theory of evolution, fossil rabbits in the Precambrian. No such rabbits, no authentically anachronistic fossils of any kind have ever been found. All the fossils that we have, and there are very, very many indeed, occur without a single authenticated exception in the right temporal sequence. Yes, there are gaps where there are no fossils at all, and that's only to be expected. But not a single solitary fossil has ever been found before it could have evolved. That's a very telling fact, and there's no reason why we should expect it on the creationist theory. A good theory, a scientific theory, is one that is vulnerable to disproof, yet is not disproved. Evolution could so easily be disproved if just a single fossil turned up in the wrong date order. Evolution has passed this test with flying colours.
So you see, Dawkins isn't shy about articulating that which would falsify his beliefs, even when the belief in question is constitutive of his life's work. Returning to the God hypothesis then, all we have here in Richard Dawkins is a scientist who's honest enough to admit that God is difficult to verify, and an apologist in David Wood who's dishonest enough to market this as an intellectual failing. New atheism isn't the problem. After hundreds of years of failing to demonstrate the existence of God, apologists like David have decided that they're going to bypass the debate about God's existence altogether. The new approach is to declare victory by default. How? By alleging that atheists won't change their minds anyway. So theists can't prove they're God, but even if they could, atheists allegedly wouldn't accept that proof anyway. So theists win by default. Let's call this victory by default approach new theism. Well, I gotta say, David, I much prefer the old theists. You know, the kind of theists who were willing to show up to a debate and actually discuss the existence of God. But then you new theists came along and you took that innocent little puppy and turned it into Cujo. Woof.